to Flat, Cool, and Acid-Free, an OK State Archives podcast, bringing you stories about Oklahoma State University and Oklahoma. I'm Libby Whitlow, digital storytelling intern for the OSU Libraries. In this episode, I will follow the changes OSU has made to its residential housing policies and how that narrative intertwines with equality on campus. When I first came to campus, I loved talking with older family members and friends about their experiences in the dorms. I wanted to know where they thought the best places to grab a snack were, what music they were blasting while taking a study break, and who they got to hang out with. By having these conversations with alums, I realized how different some of our housing rules were while living at OSU. I thought that students today in residential halls didn't have to give too much thought to when they have their guests over, as long as the roommates are all right with it, of course. In stark contrast, visitation rights were highly contested among students and administration at OSU during the mid-20th century. During visitation hours, a student could visit the room of another student of the opposite sex. Even as OAMC opened as a college for men and women, college officials continued to be especially wary of any situation when campus men and women got together, making strict housing rules, early curfew hours, and regulation of attendance at dances some of the stringent policies enacted, according to the history of equal opportunity at OSU. My curiosity was piqued, and I wanted to know how rules in residential life had changed over the many decades that OSU had classes in session. Discourse about changing visitation hours and other residence hall rules can be traced back to the 1950s. On May 7, 1957, a letter to the editor was published in the Ocali that described the curfew women had to observe like being in a prison. The next day, the Ocali published letters to the editor reacting to the criticism of the curfew for co-eds, with one student writing, "We'd like to see the women get free time in the evenings too, not just because dating would be easier, but because they aren't getting a fair shake." The required evening curfews for specifically female students that met opposition in the 50s would serve as the beginning of the uphill battle OSU administrators and the Board of Regents would see about policies that dictated people's movement on campus. The groundwork for the resident hall student government systems that advocated for the change that undergraduate students wanted to see dates back to World War II. The Grand Council was formed to organize social activities for the victory halls on campus during the war. In 1963, the Grand Council changed its name to the Women's Residence Hall Association. Likewise, the Independent Men's Residence Hall Council from the late 1940s was renamed to the Men's Residence Hall Association in the early 1960s. Despite perceived differences between the gendered groups, they were having annual joint meetings even in the 1950s. While the influence of these student associations spread on campus in the following decades, in the 1970s, another student group would become an important piece of the story of changing policies for women at OSU. In 1970, the Association of Women Students released their AWS Statement of Concerns in light of the civil rights enactments in federal law. AWS President Cheryl Reed and Vice Presidents Dana Beck and Margie Bell moved to change policies on campus that eradicated all discriminatory practices which relegate women to second-class status. The AWS served to represent all of the enrolled female students in social and administrative matters. Previously known as the Women's Self-Government Association in 1939, the AWS changed its name and continued to influence beauty queen contests at OSU, sponsor social activities for women, and organize speakers to talk about women's issues on a male-centric OAMC campus. In 1970, the AWS and its Women's Rights Commission was charged with being involved in the women's liberation movement, to which second VP Margie Bell responded with, "The AWS is not in any way related to the women's liberation movement, although we do agree with them on some issues." Interestingly put by the author Patrick M. Murphy in History of OSU Student Life and Services, in general, the AWS gently pushed for women's equality, perhaps, at times, unknowingly. AWS leadership targeted required housing policies because they were rooted in historic rules based on the perceived differences between males and females. Compulsory housing was imposed on women, while men were typically free to choose where they lived and travel as they pleased. June Tyhurst, a co-editor of the Ocali, while campus was buzzing with these issues, wrote that OSU co-eds who enroll here when they're 18 must wait 3 years until their 21st birthday to achieve the same rights that male students take for granted from the time they're freshmen. At present, male students are neither required to live on campus or in supervised off-campus housing, nor do those who live on campus in dormitories have any hours. This no-rule policy applies whether a male student's a freshman or a graduate student, a 4.0 student, or a 0.0 student. According to Zelma Patchen, Associate Dean of Students, OSU men have never had any rules governing their hours or a compulsory policy on where to live. While the decade leading up to the AWS's demands saw more liberating changes in women's visiting hours in the residence halls, along with other requirements, the rules and subsequent treatment between males and females persisted. Even before the 1970s, residence hall student government associations that represented men and women respectively were able to work together. They held joint meetings to represent the undergraduate student population on campus. Together, the Residence Halls Association, 16 living groups, the Panhellenic Council, and the Student Senate decided to support the AWS and adopted resolutions to support them. The university responded in the fall of 1970 that there will be no further liberalization of these hours or policies for the foreseeable future. The AWS had organized a protest in February on the library lawn. 500 people started on the lawn, and about 2,000 ended in the Student Union ballroom. The AWS also threatened the university with a lawsuit, as they were inspired by recent lawsuits over free speech on campus that spurred the university to action. In the following month of March, Willem Hall co-eds that were separate from AWS filed lawsuits against OSU regulations they described as discriminatory, arbitrary, capricious, and based on sexual differences. The OSU Board of Regents responded in less than a week with new regulations that helped the university avoid the lawsuit charged by the Willem Hall co-eds. Beginning in the fall semester of 1971, all unmarried men and women freshmen and sophomore students under the age of 21 were required to live in university housing. They were also regulated to the same open hours or visitation hours, midnights Sunday through Thursdays, and 1:30 a.m. Friday and Saturday. The student response to this was a smaller 450 student sit-in at the Board of Regents offices in the Student Union, where the RHA Assembly was encouraged to pursue progressive action for the future. The 21st century ushered in more liberalizing rules and regulations for the residential halls at OSU. When I lived on campus, anybody could have any guest they wanted in their room at any time as long as their roommate approved, and consecutive overnight stays were no more than 2 nights. After researching about the effort it took to keep restrictive policies from targeting female students like myself, I realized that I had bold individuals who were passionate about equality on campus to thank for my privileges. I thought that this strong push to change unequal housing policies had roots in feminism. While feminist can be a buzzword, for the purpose of this podcast, I am considering the Oxford Languages definition of feminism that defines the term as the advocacy of women's rights on the basis of the equality of the sexes. As previously mentioned, while the AWS did not consider itself related to the women's liberation movement, their actions aligned closely with the dictionary's definition of feminism. In October of 1970, Dawn Davis reported in the Daily Occollegian about the AWS's movement against OSU housing hours and policies. A letter sent to OSU administrators criticized rules and regulations of the university that negate women students from being considered intelligent, mature, and capable adults. The letter also stated that blatant discrimination based solely on sex is practiced throughout the rules on women students. When the AWS called for the elimination of policies targeting women on campus, their argument paralleled feminist efforts by leveling the playing field. In this piece of OSU history, the push to equalize rules and regulations for men and women on campus benefited student residential life in the long run. Theme music is It's a Process, composed by Ben Stone and Finlay Green and published by BBC Production Music PRS. From the folks at the Oklahoma State University Libraries and the Archives, thanks for listening, and always remember to keep your archival material flat, cool, and acid-free.